Welcome to episode 7B of Saying Something Sober, the podcast where I decide the topic and it could be literally anything. Today's topic, Straitjacket Part 2, Escape. Before I get into it, it goes without saying that this comes with a massive trigger warning. One thing about this section, Part 2, Escape, is that it is really, really dense. It's a lot denser than the previous section, and the previous section was quite dense. I was reading it quite often on the way to work on the bus, and I actually had to stop doing that because I got within the section about halfway and he starts talking about overdoses and these dark topics, and I actually had to stop reading the book in the morning because of those tough topics and how it started to illuminate things for me about how much I know and how much I knew, or I should say how little I know and how little I knew. And one interesting thing is that whilst I was reading it, I actually had some revelations that coincided with some feedback at work. And although generally it was overwhelmingly positive, there was certain feedback that aligned with things that I was thinking about myself because of stuff that I'd read in the book. You know, he talks about how we fall down these pessimistic spirals and we get so involved in ourselves because we grow up teaching ourselves anxiety, essentially, and that naturally breeds this self-obsession. And that was generally the feedback I got, that sometimes when push comes to shove, I tend to absorb into my own issues and can't see the wood from amongst the trees. And though it was tough, it's enlightening to be able to read this and have it coincide with stuff in my real life at work. But getting right into it, on the first page of the first section, he quotes from writer Juno Dawson from a BuzzFeed interview stating, "At some point during school, I decided I could either feel hurt or feel nothing. So I opted for nothing. I swapped feelings for achievements. I poured myself into goals and ambitions." And I relate heavily to this quote. It makes me think of when I was at school, and really what I realize is a lot of the time I had downplayed in my mind or forgotten how much I was picked on, really, and how much I was essentially bullied or singled out in some sense. I remember one experience when I was on the School Musical. I think I had a lead role, and I had brought these sweets that my mum had bought me from America to school. And it was after school that we were doing the rehearsal, and I came off the stage and went into the changing rooms. I went into my bag, and some boys in the year above me, for some unknown reason, had gone through my bag, found the sweets, emptied them all out or eaten them, and filled the sweet bag with dirty brown water, which obviously was then put back into my bag. I remember feeling very isolated, feeling very cornered, because I didn't know why they'd done it. I had no understanding as to why I had been picked on like this. Maybe they were jealous that I had a lead role. Maybe I was too feminine or whatever. It doesn't really matter. I guess my point is, through reading this book, I've had memories come back of these experiences, like being cornered and being asked if I was gay outright, and just this panic that rises in your chest. It's like nothing I've ever felt before. He also quotes Ollie Alexander, who's obviously the UK's 2024 Eurovision entrant. And Ollie states, "I've been stuck in a cycle of being addicted to rejection in some fucked up way and always choosing someone who's going to reject me." And obviously, Matthew is teeing up the concept of addiction here. Obviously, the concept of addiction is quite a heavy one, but here he's saying addiction to rejection, which is a bit, I guess, an oddball take on addiction. Typically, people would think of addiction as substance-based, but here he's teeing up what he goes on to discuss. And he actually states, "The traditional understanding, what is called the pharmaceutical theory of addiction, asserts that some drugs are so chemically powerful that anyone who uses them will become hooked. That doesn't explain why some people use a range of drugs and don't become addicted, nor does it explain why there seems to be higher rates of addiction amongst LGBT people. this is a topic that I think is relatively unexplored in the mainstream. I think it's difficult to discuss addiction because it's often met with this idea of pharmaceutical addiction, being addicted to substances. But the gay community and what Matthew goes on to talk about, it's much broader than that. And at least for me, I look at my own life and it's like I live with nothing in moderation, or used to live with nothing in moderation. Matthew states addiction is a dysfunctional way of soothing overwhelming distress. And that idea of soothing overwhelming distress is something I'm working on to stop. I'm working on finding ways that are within myself to soothe this distress or to soothe whatever. I think I'd gotten so used to just using an external source to soothe whatever I was feeling or whatever I was going through. And that's unhealthy. It's temporary. And ultimately that thing is going to run out and you're going to need to find a new version of it or more of it. And it's just a never-ending cycle that you really have to break away from completely. And something really interesting that Matthew quotes or uses is the specific Canadian research study about rats where they were put in a cage and offered regular water or water with drugs in it, and they found that the rats got addicted. But then they did a secondary part to it where they were offered the same, but they also were offered a theme park with loads of other rats, rat park as they called it. And they found that when the rats were isolated and caged in, they always went for the drugs. But when they had the theme park, they always went for the theme park. And he states a major factor in the rats' drug use was that they were relieving the pain of being alone and cooped up. The idea of loneliness in the gay community is definitely something I relate to, and I'm sure a lot of other people to relate to it. So it all starts to link up, I think, and definitely connect to my own experience. This first section is called False Selves and Survival Skills, Chronic Recurrent Humiliation, Distorted Thinking, and Addiction. And really the key first point that Matthew talks about is children or growing up and the idea of oversensitivity and where that comes from. He states, in his book, Who Says I'm an Addict, therapist David Smallwood suggests that addicts are born with greater oversensitivity than others. Their limbic system, the part of the brain that governs emotions, is naturally more sensitive in some people. They are therefore more easily overwhelmed and so have a greater need to dull those feelings. And this idea that oversensitivity is key is really interesting, especially to me, because being diagnosed with ADHD and exploring in myself the potential that I'm on the spectrum, oversensitivity or hypersensitivity is a well-known symptom of those conditions or neurodivergencies. So the idea that that could come hand in hand with this emotional issues that I've experienced is quite interesting. He states, there is a growing understanding that experiencing trauma at a young age makes people more likely to display addictive behavior as adults. And I think that's something we can all generally understand, but he uses some studies to back that up. And one of them is about 9/11 and how the kids in a certain class at school who were directly affected were more likely to go on and have emotional issues like addiction or mental health issues. But on the point of ADHD and autism, Matthew states, for others who are naturally more sensitive, it takes far less sometimes. Even just leaving the house or interacting with people can be overwhelming. And obviously I mentioned hypersensitivity as a symptom of these kind of neurodivergencies. That idea that daily experience can be stressful is shocking to read, but also very relatable. I often struggle with eye contact. I struggle with conversation. And I feel like I'm always performing when I go out of the house. I feel like I'm always on, if that makes sense. So this idea that my oversensitivity could be connected to this other issue, which is all rooted in this overwhelming stress that I feel from just living, is interesting. He also refers to the limbic system, which is that part of the brain that leads people to be sensitive. And he talks about how it can be overstimulated and that limbic system can be permanently affected so that it's more sensitive. And it's interesting that there's like a biological level to this. The same as when I got diagnosed with ADHD, like finding out these issues are connected to actual biological things. It makes me think of how people talk about trans athletes and how they shouldn't be allowed in the Olympics because they have biological advantages. But if you look at someone like Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer for the United States, he has a really long wingspan, above average for a man of his age, a really high lung capacity, above average for his age, and he even has webbed feet and hands, I think. And so this idea of biological advantages in the Olympics is just null and void, really, because on a biological level, every individual person is so widely different that it's going to impact our experience of the world so much more. He also talks about blocking emotions or dissociation. And earlier I mentioned how that feeling of paranoia or panic when you're younger and you get called out for being gay is palpable. And he references a study and the doctor says, and I quote, "The one which had the biggest impact by 15% over anything else, including incest, was chronic recurrent humiliation, what we termed as emotional abuse." And there he's talking about what had the biggest impact on the limbic system. And it's interesting that this idea of chronic recurrent humiliation is the biggest player. And that's definitely something that I think LGBT kids experience, because to them, being outed or people finding out that they're gay is so shameful, it's embarrassing, it's humiliating. And that panic and that stress that you experience on a day-to-day basis, trying to hide it, would ultimately come under recurrent humiliation, at least in my opinion. But he goes on to talk about dulling painful feelings, and he states, "When we use outside things to dull painful feelings, it's hard to know what we actually feel." And that is extremely relevant to my journey and my current focus. I'm trying to get better at not using external things, like I said, to soothe these distresses. And that's because for the longest time, I thought I was just a very logical, pragmatic person. And that's why I didn't feel emotions very strongly. Really, what it came to is I don't really know what I feel a lot of the time because I'm not really feeling it right there and then. It takes time for me to explore what I'm feeling. I got some bad news about an ex in August, and I remember finding out and in my head thinking I should be crying or I should be sad, and I am sad, but I don't feel sad. It's a very confusing place to be. He continues in the book and states, "It's only by experiencing our real, authentic selves and emotions that we learn and grow." And that's what I mean by this is where my focus is. It's something that is covered in The Velvet Rage by Alan Downs, this idea of cultivating authenticity being the only route to salvation, I guess. And so that's what I'm trying to do. It's extremely difficult and it's an extremely slow process. That's what I'm finding out, but it is imperative really to recovery. Matthew continues and goes on to talk about codependency and counterdependency. And he defines codependency as overly dependent on other people and their feelings, and counterdependency as people who push people away and act as if they don't need anyone. And when I first read this, I remember thinking that I probably flipped between the two. But Matthew continues, "It seems to me that counterdependency is a reaction to codependency. I believe counterdependents can't cope with their oversensitive feelings, so shut them down, convincing themselves that they are hard, tough, and untouchable." And that's definitely more me. So initially, I thought I flipped between, but I most definitely fall in the counterdependency side of things. Because I remember rationalizing and minimizing negative feelings growing up. I remember thinking that kind of suicidal ideation was a normal thing. It was a rational thing. I convinced myself that all people who go through puberty go through this level of emotional distress. And it was only when I went to uni and kind of jokingly expressed these feelings to a friend of mine that she called me up on it and told me that's not healthy. You need to think about that. And that was shocking to me because for the longest time, I thought I was too tough. Thought I was made of stronger stuff to actually get impacted by this stuff. And that's just not true. That's just your ego talking. Your ego wants to believe that you're tougher, but nobody is. And all of this touches upon the iceberg theory that Matthew goes on to, which I've seen used before in other contexts. It's this idea that above the surface, an iceberg looks small, but beneath the water, it's actually much, much larger. And he states that addictions are symptoms of an unseen problem with self-hatred and fear at its core, surrounded by all manner of problematic, compulsive behaviors and attitudes. And he lists some characteristics broadly, stating perfectionism, self-obsession, grandiosity, judgmentalism, rigid black and white thinking, low self-worth, resentment, self-pity, and negative thinking. And all of that is very, very relevant and definitely stuff I can relate to. Perfectionism, for sure. I've already spoken about self-obsession and this idea that teaching yourself anxiety as you grow up leads you to be self-obsessed because you're only thinking about yourself all the time. It's a defense mechanism for sure, but it's going to naturally breed a lack of a wider view of the world. And Matthew actually articulates it in a way that I really like. He states, feeling like the biggest piece of shit that the world spins around. And that is so, it's funny, but it's also so apt. It's so right. Feeling like just the most worthless person, but you're the main character of the TV show. I guess it's like BoJack Horseman, which is a great show if you haven't seen it. And he talks about how all of those issues are beneath the surface, and the thing that is at the top, the thing that we see, is the compulsive behavior, the addictive behavior. And addictive behaviors or compulsive behaviors are all about control and toleration. How much can you be in control of it? So you use these external things to be in control, and then your toleration of them goes up, so you have to find new things. He states, changing those feelings with a drug gives us a sense of being in control. And it's important to stress gives us a sense, because it's impossible to be in control in those situations. It's just feeling like you are because you're the one doing the thing. But again, he refers to a certain chemical or biological level of this. He states, for someone who feels bad a lot or is overwhelmed by anxiety, the difference between being sober and being drunk or high is more extreme. And it's almost like for someone whose serotonin levels are always low, drinking and getting serotonin or getting dopamine, I suppose, is a much greater feeling. And that links to how when I got meds for my ADHD, things did start to shift, especially mentally. And I think it's probably because my dopamine levels were more in line with how they should be. And so potentially the desire to use or drink was lower because the effect wasn't as great. Back to the point about control and being out of control, you probably start these things to feel in control. And for a while you maybe are, or you maybe feel like you are, but at some point you realize you're not and you can't stop. There's that famous saying, 1 is too many and 1,000 never enough. But what's really important that he calls out is this idea of the fuck it button. The idea that the reason that you're out of control is because at some point you hit that fuck it button and you just go crazy. And he states compulsion overrides the part of the brain that knows the right thing to do. And that's like, if once you take that first drink, your body might hit that fuck it button and your compulsion will just override that sensical part of the brain. It's almost like, at least for me, I remember there being almost two sides of my brain. One that's logical and like, you should go home or you shouldn't do that. And the other that's just like, but why not? Who cares? It's going to be fun. And it's quite a scary place to be honest. That recklessness, you almost don't realize it's possible or don't realize it's inside of you. And then that side of your brain goes, why not? Or who cares? And it's scary. And then Matthew goes on to list out some addiction types, and there's all of the expected ones, but there's a few that I want to linger on. So he calls out self-harm and states, over half of LGBTQ young people had self-harmed compared to 35% of straight cis people. Young LGBT people were almost twice as likely to make a suicide attempt. He also calls out in sex, he states, the same parts of the brain light up when someone is in love as when a person is using cocaine, which is a really interesting, again, biological level point. And all of these things are obviously things people wouldn't necessarily consider as things you can be addicted to, but you definitely can. At least, I mean, in my opinion, you can be addicted to anything. Everything gives you some kind of feeling, and if it gives you a good one, then you can be addicted to it. And then in affirmation and validation, he states, bringing other people down can also be powerful if you don't feel good about yourself. He also states that's all show business is, affirmation and escaping feelings. And he's talking about there how celebrities and famous people are typically the ones who are most damaged or most hurt, or, you know, we see a lot of celebrities kind of crash and burn in terms of addiction and alcoholism. And he's stating that it's not a chicken and egg kind of thing. You can kind of pinpoint why that is, and it's because the same type of people are going into show business, and it's the people that are looking for validation. Earlier, I mentioned that he refers to self-obsession and perfectionism, and he kind of circles back to that point, and he states self-obsession is simply a natural step from hypervigilance and insecurity. And this is my point about how self-taught anxiety breeds self-absorption. And reading this section coincided with feedback at work, like I said, and it all kind of came to the same conclusion for me, which is that I need to be more optimistic. I need to be on top of my emotions and my head and check myself, really. But he continues, hand in hand with self-obsession comes perfectionism, and I'm most definitely a perfectionist. It's almost a curse, really. Though I produce really high levels of quality of work at work, it's also, I push myself to limits that I don't necessarily have the ability to push myself to. And it's not a healthy thing to do, you know, to push yourself to that limit every single time. Of course, sometimes you may need to push yourself to that limit, but those will be the really important times. The times that aren't so important, you don't need to do that. And similar to the iceberg theory, Matthew uses a Russian doll analogy. So obviously Russian dolls are those dolls that have similar dolls inside of them. And he states, this little one represents the original wounded child. The outside shell, the person we present to the world, is not our authentic self. This is the adapted adult child, a child who has adapted to deal with the wound, but not been able to develop into an emotionally authentic adult. And ultimately, that is the goal of my journey and of recovery, which is to develop into an emotionally authentic adult, because for the longest time, I haven't been, or at least I haven't been fully. And that image of the original wounded child is something that I subconsciously remember picturing every time that I was out and partying. I remember picturing this disappointed, ashamed child. And weirdly, in the same moment, I was having this image of myself, which was kind of grotesque version of myself doing what I was doing and partying. And that comes from that deep-rooted shame and that deep-rooted disappointment that I've become this thing that I thought I'd never be, which is obviously a hyperbolization of the reality, but its feelings and that inner child, or that idea of an inner child, is really, really feeling that hurt. But just to close off this chapter, I wanted to quote a quote about Elton John. He states, in David Furnish's documentary about Elton John, Tantrums and Tiaras, Elton's therapist said that he had only just started to believe that his sellout audiences genuinely wanted him to be there. despite outside esteem on the biggest scale possible. For a time, his success made him feel worse than ever before. The next section is called I Know a Place Where You Can Get Away, Fantasy and Entertainment. And he starts off talking about Judy Garland and gay men. And weirdly, this relates very heavily to something that I read for my dissertation. So I did my dissertation in film. It was on the representation of conversion therapy in cinema. But I read an essay for that by Richard Dyer called Judy Garland and Gay Men, where he talks about and kind of asserts this connection between gay men and Judy Garland specifically, but also broadly women in the public eye who exhibit kind of vulnerability and pain. And he quotes the iconic Cher on the first page, and she stated, "I think what you guys like is a strong woman that's having a breakdown constantly, and that certainly is me. Judy Garland's got nothing on me." He talks about the friend of Dorothy idea, this name that gay men adopted as a way to codify the fact that they were gay. I think there's a interesting story about the Chicago Police Department thinking that they needed to find this woman called Dorothy. Matthew states, "We love the tragedy of Judy Garland's life, the failed relationships, the drunken carnage. Certainly, we may glibly enjoy the dark tragicomedy of her life. But I didn't know anything of this when I was a child, yet the powerful connection was there." And I think it's interesting that we all kind of gravitate to these female figures. And I don't necessarily remember doing it growing up. I was quite closeted and I was quite to myself. I didn't kind of exhibit or openly express the things that I was interested in because of fear of being found out. But now as an adult and kind of as a 18-year-old at uni, I definitely gravitated towards these female figures, and even now find myself defending them, even though I don't really know them. And I think the powerful connection definitely comes from their vulnerability, but also their kind of feminine power. Their feminine power in the face of adversity is, for a gay man who's meant to be masculine, is admirable. Not all gay men are feminine, obviously, but we all have dealt with the difficulty of coming to terms with the fact that you're not what society says a man should be. And earlier, Matthew talked about codependency and counterdependency, and he states about Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. The connection with Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz is not simply because of the campiness and the colour, but because the film is a tale of codependency portrayed by one of the most famous codependents of all time. And when he stated this, I was kind of taken aback because that's not what I think of The Wizard of Oz, as a tale of a codependent. But then you think about it a little bit more, and it's all about a girl who doesn't live with her parents, who feels like they don't love her enough and wants them to love her more. And then she has a dream about going on an adventure with a guy who doesn't have a heart and needs help to feel his feelings, a guy who doesn't have a brain and needs help to think his thoughts, and a cowardly lion who can't do anything for himself. And it starts to paint that picture of how these characters are codependent on each other. And then he goes on to talk about films and escapism more broadly. And for me, film is a huge passion of mine. I studied at university, so all of this is really, really relevant to me. And he asked the question why we use films and media as escapism. He states, "The simple answer is because at a time when we were overwhelmed by the danger of our existence, clutching for a rope to pull us out of the pit of fear, this shiny, unreal, neon world of artifice, of glamour, of making something beautiful out of the dullness, offers us a way to escape, to disconnect from reality." And I think it's well documented that film and TV are forms of escapism. But interestingly, he states it's not just a gay thing, it's the story of all show business. And then he quotes from Chicago, which is written by a gay duo. And Roxy states, "I'm a star and the audience loves me and I love them and they love me for loving them and I love them for loving me and we just love each other. And a boy states, and that's because none of us got enough love in our childhoods. And Roxy replies, and that's showbiz, kid. And obviously that's tongue in cheek, but it's true. Escapism as a child is escapism from the world that we don't want to believe is real into a world that we want to believe is real. And what Matthew is talking about gets me thinking about what some of my favourite films used to be or what they are now. And growing up, some of my favourite films were Big, Groundhog Day, My Fair Lady, weirdly, The Goonies, Turner and Hooch. And then growing up, getting a bit older, it was Mean Girls, Legally Blonde, Lovely Bones, Alien, all the X-Men films. And nowadays, it's still Alien, Hellraiser, still Legally Blonde, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is obviously a more recent one. And I guess I start thinking about what all of that says about me. And the first one I could remember was Big, growing up. And it's obviously about a young boy who wakes up and he's an adult. And I wonder if that says something about how I wanted to grow up faster. But another piece of media that I was enamored with growing up that he actually refers to is Doctor Who. Interestingly, he states about 70% of post-2005 Doctor Who was written by gay men, which I didn't know. I did know that it was popular amongst the gay community, and I did know that a lot of the writers were gay. I know that Russell T Davies himself is gay. But it's interesting that so much of it is actually written by gay people. It's written by gay people, almost for gay people. He also states, Russell believes the escapism narrative put forward to explain science fiction's appeal to gay people is negative because it implies terror. He believes instead it is attractive because gay people are freer, happier, more able to accept colour and campness. Matthew continues, I think we are drawn to Doctor Who precisely because he is a stoic loner, emotionally detached, and literally leaves before anyone gets close enough for him to have to face his emotions. And that's a very cynical point of view from Matthew. And I do kind of agree, it's probably more accurate, but I think there's truth in both. I think gay people or children growing up who are dealing with this emotional distress, who are looking to escape, are more willing to accept campness and colour, are more willing to suspend their disbelief, but are also looking for representation of how they're feeling. I was also really into Percy Jackson growing up, and I've talked about how I was really into the X-Men films, and both of those are texts that are essentially kids who are born different, having a place to go, having a place to belong. And so I guess thinking about it now, it's interesting that those were texts that I gravitated towards. I was obviously a child who felt like I didn't belong, who felt like I wasn't right. And these tried to make sense of that for me in the form of saying I had superpowers, essentially. I was also really into horror, or am really into horror now. And he talks about that in the book. He states, horror also holds a disproportionate appeal to many LGBT people. And I've, for the longest time, said that horror is my favourite genre. He even quotes Harry Benshoff, which is an essay that I read at university because I wrote an essay on Hellraiser and homosexuality. He states, the appeal doesn't arise from sexuality, but from the fact that LGBT children are so traumatized that they subconsciously latch onto anything in which they can sense otherness. The point here, I think, is key, is the sensing otherness. He states that it's to do with trauma. That's a very negative, pessimistic way to look at it. I don't necessarily think it's this awful emotional response. I think it's more so they are joyous to see something that they feel that they can relate to, which is this otherness. The last part of this section, he talks about pop music and gay fascination. And this is definitely what I think dominates the mainstream right now. I think we are seeing Madonna go on a world tour and she's selling out, and most definitely the majority of that audience are gay men. She's got drag queens as her supporting act, so it's a huge pull for gay men for sure. But in this section, he articulates what I was saying earlier about women. He states, it's commonly accepted that the kind of women that appeal to gay men are strong women, when in fact it's a streak of vulnerability and even victimhood that these women often show that is actually closer to the truth. It's quite interesting that we flock to victimhood in this way. And again, I think it's to do with that feeling of kinship. We feel on the same wavelength as her almost, because we're supposed to be these feminine people because we subvert masculinity by being gay. And we also feel victim. And then we see a feminine figure open up about victimhood. He continues, we sense in them the vulnerability and strength that we have too. Dysfunction that often pans out into difficult personal lives the way it does for some of us. And he specifies examples of this. He states, Madonna's ambition, she said, was driven by feeling unloved after the death of her mother. Streisand had said she felt unloved and ugly. Gaga has broken down in tears on stage expressing how she felt not good enough growing up. And I think it's all connected to this idea that femininity is what gay men feel aligned with. And then also this feeling of inadequacy that they show, and that growing up they had this emotional difficulty that we can relate to. It's a really complex thing because there's not really a one-size-fits-all answer, but it's interesting that there is this kind of phenomenon over time. And I even notice it in my own music taste. If I was to do a demographic breakdown of all the artists that I listen to, it would most definitely be 80%, maybe 90% women. But just to close off this section, there's another important quote at the end of it that provides some hope. He states, fortunately for us, as for Dorothy, there is a way out of the mess we're in. And as for her, it comes from within ourselves. But like her, most of us go through a lot of pain before we can get there. The next section is called Either Fuck Me or Fuck Off, Small Town Boys on Old Competition Street, which is obviously quite a funny name, being a play on Old Compton Street in Soho. He starts this section off quite strongly with a quote from John Grant in a Guardian interview that states, "It's quite brutal. If you're beautiful and you have the right genes, then the gay scene is a place where you can be worshipped. Coming out was tough enough. To then go into a gay scene and realise that it's even worse." I think that captures what is ultimately so depressing and sad about the state of the community. It's so obsessed with physical attraction and appearances that it's not focusing on what it was set up to be for, which was community. He makes an interesting point, which is that when you are a novelty, you stand out more, and that being visible can be dangerous. It's things like fearful of public displays of affection, performing in public, feeling like you're putting on a straight version of yourself, not being as flamboyant, an inability to just be yourself or even know how. I came out at 19, and then the years after that, it was a lot of self-discovery that a lot of my peers had done in their early teens, maybe even earlier than that. I was behind the curve, and to be honest, still feel like I am. I spent so long pretending to be somebody else, I almost don't know who I am. And it's even deeper than that, because not only do I not know who I am, I'm just not sure of the things that I like. What are my hobbies? When I started my journey, when I became sober, the first really difficult question was, what do I do with all this free time? For so long, my hobbies had been going out, drinking, and that's not what I want to do anymore. But now I don't know what to do, which is ultimately why I started this podcast. So here we are. He talks about how within the community, everyone seems to know everyone. And this is definitely a thing for London. It makes dating impossible because it feels like you're dating within a friend group. He states, on the rare occasion that you do meet someone new, you discover you have a minimum of 5 mutual friends on Facebook. Now, a little bit outdated because it quotes Facebook, and obviously nowadays Instagram is what you give out to people, but you always have mutual followers with people that you meet out. And it's kind of infuriating because you can't find someone who's just yours, which is, I think, an element of dating. I think my fear of dating within the community or dating someone that my friends know comes from this learnt behavior that the community isn't safe, really. Matthew talks about this. He states, A 23-year-old man who escaped from a small town to the outskirts of London said he was mesmerised, astounded by being so close to such a large gay scene, but also found it intimidating. I felt I was being judged, and since haven't plucked up the courage to go back. And interestingly, that's a quote from that 23-year-old man, and he uses the phrase plucked up the courage, which is a depressing phrase to use about the community. If you have to be brave to face the community, then it's not really a community. This is further made real and characterized by the use of tweets that Matthew puts in the book. He states, clicky, in your face, stereotypical, sad, gives a bad impression of the gay life, I would say. Hate it, wish it didn't exist, a giant schoolyard of playground bullying, bitchiness, and spreads a lot of hate from within. It's like anything else in life, it's what you make of it. You can choose to be mired in the drama or simply rise above it. It's interesting, almost ironic, that these tweets are being judgmental of the community. And though what they are saying, I do agree with and have experienced, it's this bitterness that we have towards each other. And it can even be read here. Matthew theorizes our complicated relationship with the scene comes from how we feel about ourselves and other gay people, and from the context of how we arrive on the scene and what we expect from it. If you accept that to some degree, many if not most of us are abuse survivors, then the gay scene is unique in that it is a place where we are mixing with a lot of other abuse survivors, traumatized people socializing with lots of other traumatized people. And though I agree, I almost hadn't put it into words in this way. I have experienced traumatized people exhibiting their trauma on other people. I've been in experiences where friends or people I know have been cruel or mean to me or to other people. And you are aware that it comes from their trauma, but it's catty, all looking for jabs at each other. It can be quite a toxic place to be. Building on that, Matthew gives these three concepts. He talks about negative mirroring. Other gay people are a mirror of the thing we aren't comfortable within ourselves, and that dislike will come out directed at them. Since becoming sober, I've had people react to me in a negative way because, at least from what I can deduce, I am an image of what they wish that they were, or I am a mirror and they look at me and what they see is how much of a mess their life is because I'm not anymore like them. Matthew does state if we aren't comfortable with ourselves, then a gay bar is like being in a house of mirrors. And he starts talking about how a lot of anti-gay politicians and extremely religious priests end up coming out as gay, and it gets into a slightly dangerous rhetoric that I kind of want to push back on. It starts to get into blaming gays, blaming gay men for homophobia. Homophobic people aren't all closeted, and homophobia is not a gay product. It's a gay burden, but it's not a gay product. And sure, these people exhibited homophobia, but it's also their internalized burden. And it shouldn't be seen as this cycle of gay people oppressing other gay people, because that's just not the reality. That's not where homophobia comes from, and that's not the source of it. And I see this kind of discourse online get to a worrying place where any anti-gay politician, any extremely religious priest is just written off as being, oh, he's closeted. Or even just videos where someone's being homophobic, someone will say, oh, he's just closeted. And that's a dangerous rhetoric because it doesn't matter really. That person is being homophobic. That's part of an oppressive system. And we need to be aware of actually where that is coming from. The next concept is invalidation potential. And Matthew states, if we start from a place of feeling worthless, a rejection or rude remark devastates us because it confirms what we subconsciously believe about ourselves. And ultimately, this is why I deleted Grindr and have kept it deleted. I'm not re-downloading it. I don't want to put myself in that space. I've had people just say nasty things because I'm not replying. I had one guy message me. I didn't reply because I wasn't interested. That person obviously then went to my Instagram, came back and said, saw your Instagram and no longer interested anyways. and called me some name. Grindr is like a space where everyone's looking for validation from the most validating person that is there. So the hottest person that's there. Matthew talks about that. He talks about sex for validation. He states that people who are validation junkies, desire for sex is often more about a compulsive need for a hit of validation. And I've definitely found myself in that mindset, especially with Grindr. It's almost like you get into a habit of going to that place on your phone whenever you're bored or sat down and alone. And it's just a cycle. And then you commit to these relationships or these engagements or these conversations, and you almost feel obligated to maintain them. It's just not necessary. The last concept that Matthew talks about is extreme objectification, which I kind of touched upon when I was talking about the hottest person being the person that can provide the most validation. Matthew quotes a couple people here, and one of them stated, "The hotter the person, the better I feel about myself," which is a depressing statement, because not only do you feel awful about yourself, but you're also reducing the person that you're meeting up with to just their looks, to just what they can provide you on a physical basis. And that's not interesting. I find that some of the best connections that I've made, friendships that I've made, are people that I sit down and have a conversation with and learn about. People are interesting, and you should be interested to get to know them beyond just their body. Matthew continues, such a huge focus on casual sex isn't problematic for reasons of morality, but because it demands higher and higher standards of physical perfection. The most desirable man receives the greatest validation and is himself most prized because he can give more validation to other people. And this is the point. The man himself, the hottest man, is then simply drilled down to only his looks. He's only worth what he's worth because he can provide sexual validation to others and nothing more. And that's not something that I want to engage with. I want to be valued as a person because what I can offer on an intellectual level, on an emotional level, on a relationship-based level. I want my friends to be interesting and be interested in me. I also think it's important to point out that he states it's not for reasons of morality to judge sexual promiscuity, but it's like if someone's just doing this for validation, then it's not just about sexual promiscuity, it's about covering up a deep-rooted issue. On the flip side, Matthew talks about sexual anorexia. When people withdraw from relationships, it's called emotional anorexia, while withdrawing from sexual intimacy is called sexual anorexia. Often people switch from one to the other, all then nothing, then all again. And I definitely relate to that. I think the concept online is referred to as a hoe phase. You go through a phase of extreme sexual promiscuity and then a phase of the exact opposite. A while ago, roughly just under 2 years ago, I actually contracted monkeypox, and it was one of the most traumatic experiences I've been through. Essentially 4 weeks of isolation and extreme pain and illness. It was really not a nice experience. I would never want to go through again or wish on anybody. The trauma of that actually made me retreat from sex. It made me fearful of those kind of interactions. It definitely put into my head that my reckless behavior was putting me in situations that I wasn't necessarily completely aware of the potential repercussions. With the community so obsessed with physical appearance, Matthew states we're all on borrowed time. He even uses the example, even my extraordinarily attractive older friend told me, I am marveling at the speed at which I am slowly becoming invisible. As I hit my mid-40s, I am disappearing before my very eyes. And the idea of becoming invisible at your mid-40s, you're still young, probably not even middle-aged at that point, and you're feeling like you're becoming invisible, you're disappearing. I spoke earlier about how people can be interesting, and to me, older gay people, older gay men especially, are the most interesting people. They have stories of surviving the HIV epidemic, They have stories of hardship, and it's disheartening to see this kind of account. But obviously, I know that it's real because I've lived within the community. I've probably partaken in what this person is talking about. I think what is the saddest, and Matthew kind of pinpoints this towards the end of the section, is he states, so many of us come from a place where we've felt not good enough and have had to change to fit in. And then we found ourselves in another place where we still feel not good enough and have to change to fit in. The next section is called Compare and Despair, Food, Perfection, Body Image, and Control. And in this section, he tackles the topic of eating disorders broadly, but he states, people rarely mention the word addiction or talk of mental health, or crucially, recovery. And though I've not specifically experienced eating disorders myself, I think the comment here that people rarely mention the word addiction or really crucially talk about recovery is really important. I alluded to earlier in the episode that people are fearful of branding something as addiction because it has certain connotations and it's typically seen as substance-based only. And calling something like food addictive is scary. Matthew also quotes that studies have shown that, like drugs, ingesting sugar and other complex carbohydrates which convert to sugar causes a dopamine release that gives us a high. This book was obviously written 2015, 2016, and recent governmental stuff has shown that HFSS is a big consideration and the tackle on sugar is very much an ongoing conversation. But the idea that food can be addictive and gives us a high gives truth to the idea that there are things in life that are addictive to us that we might not consider it possible, but they are. Matthew goes on to state, our bodies are the physical manifestation of who we are, so it makes sense that if we don't like ourselves, then the first thing we don't like is our bodies. And I think this idea of almost self-harm through food or eating, but also broadly through addiction is really interesting. I've long considered the idea that there's a certain reputational damage that can be done by drinking too much or by doing these crazy things, having these crazy nights. And almost in a way that is self-harm. I remember an experience where I arrived to a friend's 30th birthday completely blackout drunk. And I don't remember the night, but I met people that night and then reintroduced myself to them at a later date, which is obviously extremely embarrassing. I was anxious to arrive, which is why I drank. And on this idea of addiction broadly, he states the issue of control and perfection are central to addiction. Feeling constantly under threat makes us feel out of control, and anything that affects our mood, even temporarily, gives us the illusion of regained control. This is a similar point to what he stated earlier in relation to control and toleration. And this is definitely something, at least for me, is imbued by my parents. The idea of being in control being so important. I don't think everyone in the world thinks that they have to be in control at all times, but there are parts of me where I'm aware that I hold on to life too tight. My grip is too tight. And someone said to me lately, wear life like an ill-fitting shirt. And so that's what I've been taking forward into my life. On the topic of it being imbued by my parents, I remember a conversation, or I guess a lecture, that my mum had with me about reaching my potential and how I wasn't reaching my potential because I was doing poorly in maths at school. The context, I was not doing poorly, I was getting Bs, but she thought I could get As. And I do credit my mum for giving me an incredible drive and ambition. I am extremely ambitious as a person, but to a fault. I'm a perfectionist because I want to do great. It's probably to do with validation and affirmation. What's most interesting is some statistics that Matthew uses from a study. He states gay and bisexual men were 3 times more likely than straight men to have body image issues. And that connects to the kind of previous section about this obsession with physical attraction and bodies and how we look and appearances and reputation even, not even a physical appearance, but and a metaphysical appearance is important for gay men too. And this was obviously 2015, but I would posit that these statistics have gone up because the explosion of social media, there's so many more social medias, people are posting more, influencers are more and more common. I think that just leads way for body image issues to explode too. And on this point of obsession with physical appearance, Matthew Todd gives an anecdotal experience of when he was an Attitude editor. He states, "Someone angrily challenged me at an event. 'You'd never put Stephen Fry on the cover, would you?' So we did. It was the lowest selling issue I'd produced in that time." And he follows this up by stating, "When it comes to gay magazines, people say they want something that in reality they don't buy." And that is such a key point because I think on X, formerly known as Twitter, people love to say things, people love to complain, and vocal minorities are given a voice on that platform. And typically the things that they are saying, they don't actually live or believe when push comes to shove. And I'm wary that when I do this podcast, I'm obviously pushed to assess my own behavior and say that I'm going to make change. I'm wary that I don't want to say that I'm making change when maybe I'm not. Moving away from this obsession with physical attraction is key for me. Moving out of that space that Grindr allows and just broadly out of that space that is obsessed only with looks. Because, and this is what Matthew states, when sex becomes the main thing we want from each other, then we throw fuel on the fire of body fascism and standards get higher and higher. And I think that's what I've witnessed is you never are good enough. You're never hot enough. You're never the most attractive person in the room because the standards are always getting higher and higher. There'll always be more. And on that idea of nothing in moderation, the idea of getting bulkier and more muscular is just going to exponentially get bigger. Nothing in moderation, well, that would suggest to me that working out can also be an addiction. Just lastly from this section, I think it's important to remember the historical context behind the gay community, this generational trauma that we all have, because the reason that gay men are so obsessed with bigger, more muscular bodies is pointed out by Matthew. He states, "Combined with our childhood trauma, driven need for perfection, our insecurities about our masculinity, and the fact that in the 1980s, skinniness was a marker for unhealthiness and disease, this means many of us become obsessed with bulking up." I think that is important to remember because though it seems like we're demonizing and vilifying this obsession with physical attraction, there has to be an element of understanding where it comes from and why. Because there is the harsh reality behind all of this, which is that it's driven from trauma and not from malice. Then we move on to "You only tell me you love me when you're drunk," alcohol. And in this section, Matthew uses a lot of stories from people. In the story of David, he states he developed gastritis, an inflammation of the stomach that is common in people who consume too much alcohol. And I'm aware of this condition, and I know that it's also caused by heavy drug use. It's one of those markers of how little we know about the impact of these things and what they're doing to our bodies on a physical level. And the thing about these kind of conditions is that once they start, they're only going to get acceleratingly worse. And the only way to slow them down, not stop them, the only way to slow them down is to stop completely. You have to stop completely. He then tells the story of Simon Hobar, one of the most influential and culture-defining gay club promoters of our time, the man behind Popstars, Trash Palace and Ghetto. He gives a quote from Simon's old flatmate. "Simon was very drunk and it seems he fell over outside the door to our flat. He banged his head and passed out. It was a particularly cold night. No one knows for sure whether the head wound or the cold or the alcohol caused his death. At the inquest, it was suggested that it was a combination." And I think what's so sad about that is not only that he was a figure of the gay community, a really important, influential figure, but also that he died in this way. to think of someone so great to pass away and for us to not know exactly how. However, in this section, Matthew does make the same point that he states, most gay people do not have drink problems. I made the point in the previous episode and earlier in this episode. I'm not sure that I agree with this statement, and I do feel the need to push back on it. Obviously, this book was written in 2015, so things might have been different, but I've seen an immense number who do have an intense relationship with alcohol. And the spaces that are most popular amongst gay men are drinking spaces. And I'm not saying that they all have problems, but there's definitely a more deep-rooted issue within the community than just with some people who have a drinking problem. I think this is articulated by the Tyler Curry quote in this section. Matthew states, in TV programs such as Absolutely Fabulous, we celebrate our overuse of alcohol. As writer Tyler Curry, who has admitted to having to seriously address his own drinking, said in The Advocate, it is a part of the gay culture to laugh off alcohol abuse as part of our charm, a silly joke or a harmless offence, and for a while, it is funny. But every joke only lasts for so long, yet I was still part of the worn-out punchline. Something a friend often says to me is that, yes, jokes are jokes and they are funny, and sometimes there's nothing to them. But a lot of the time, a joke is made because there's truth or even belief in what is being joked about. I think Matthew's hesitancy to portray the gay community as having such a deep-rooted problem is understandable because you don't want to inject fear into the young gay people that might be reading. But it's also important to portray the reality of the problem. In honor of portraying the reality of the problem, I'm going to read probably one of the more shocking quotes of the section for me. He states, a mix of alcohol, Viagra, and cocaine is enough to kill you. And I've written down in my notes, this is really scary. I feel like I knew this, but I didn't really know it. Moving on to one of the concepts that Matthew talks about in this section, he calls out Catholic schoolgirl syndrome. And I obviously went to Catholic school and have obviously had a rebellious adulthood. So I think this definitely relates to me. He states, it refers to people who are in a repressive and restrictive environment for so long that they go bizarre when they get any freedom. Matthew uses a story to back this up. And the quote states, I went from being ashamed of being gay in this smaller place to thinking, I'm so fucking lucky to be gay in this amazing, dazzling world. There was a sense of there being no limits and no script, like no holds barred hedonism, which appealed to me massively. This backs up this syndrome, the idea of a repressive environment breeding someone who wants to break free. It's something I relate to quite heavily. I remember when I first moved to London, had someone asked me the question, if you could press a button and become straight, would you? I would have said yes in a heartbeat. Had they asked me that a year in, I would have said, no way, being gay is the best thing in the world. And now, if someone were to ask me that question, I would still say no. I don't believe in regrets or changing the past because it's not possible. So why even consider it? But I also am grateful to be gay. There's lots of things that I benefit from being gay. Even the emotional difficulties that you have to face and that you grow from are because you're gay. And it's good to be grateful of that growth rather than resentful. One of the harder hitting stories and difficult ones to read that he uses in this section is from Liam. And Liam states, after a while, every time I drank, it would be a fast track to oblivion. Total chaos would always ensue from a night out. In many ways, that was what was so exciting about it. I never knew where the night was going to take me. I would always lose my jacket, my keys, my wallet, my phone. That first drink was the start of a hellish inevitability that would always end the same way. The harder part to read, and I guess shocking part to read about Liam's story, is when he states, I met up with a friend and I had all the pills laid out in front of me. I remember saying to him, really wrestling with it, fuck, I might have HIV. And if I take this course of treatment, it could eradicate it, but it will mean I won't be able to drink for a month. What do you think I should do? My friend, who has HIV himself, looked at me and said, what the fuck? That's not even a debate. Take the pills. I think that really portrays the truly insidiously addictive nature of alcohol, something that in the UK is so ingrained culturally, and there's such a obsession and reliance on it as a substance. Matthew then changes gears into a different topic, which is equally as tough. He states, some older men seem to enjoy treating younger men badly through a kind of homophobic assumption that being young and slim, a chicken or twink, meant they were lesser men not deserving of respect. This is something that you see a lot online, you see a lot on Grindr. I also think that the obsession with physical attraction, physical appearance, and this use of sex as a transactional form of validation is a natural progression to this place. I think you'll always see the people that you think as hotter as less than you if you only see them as sexual objects. Matthew continues, because he was slim, older men found him attractive and he went with them. Sometimes because he wanted to, sometimes because he felt he should, sometimes because he didn't know how to say no. That last bit is key. I've always held the belief and used the phrase, there's no guide to being gay. Nobody teaches you these things. Nobody tells you how to say no. There's no guide on how to be gay. And that's across all topics, across sexual health, across how to even have sex itself, across this issue of predatory behavior, how to identify it, how to respond. There's no guide to any of it. And we have to just learn from our mistakes or learn from our friends or the internet. Ultimately, this lack of education and this growing issue of alcoholism and addiction leads to things like what happens in this story that Matthew uses. He states, he came out of blackout the next morning in a stranger's house. I felt I had to do something sexual with him to get out, so I said, do whatever you want to do. Putting so much pressure on sex as a form of validation leads it to be transactional. And when it's transactional, things like this are seen as okay. It's the place that we've led ourselves to by being obsessed with physicality and sex and not addressing the root cause of the problem. The next section is one of the more intense and harder to get through sections. It's called Horny and High, Let's Talk About Gay Sex and Drugs. And right off the bat, he kicks it off with quotes from the UK crime report from 2013 to 2014. However, I went and looked at some updated data, and what I found is from an LSE article stating the latest available data suggests that 2.6% of all adults aged 16 to 59 in England and Wales have taken any drug once a month or more in the last year. The equivalent figure for LGBT people in a 2018 Stonewall report was 9%, over 3 times as many. Existing research also indicates that the rate of substance abuse disorders among LGBTQ+ individuals, while not precisely known, may be as high as 20 to 30%, which is significantly more common than in the general population at 9%. This was attributed to factors such as the ubiquitous availability of substances within the LGBTQ+ social settings, internalized stigma and expectations of rejection, and use as a way of coping with interpersonal and structural discrimination. You can see that there's a higher frequency or a higher predisposition to these issues amongst gay men, but also the gay community widely. We don't really know the impact of all these drugs, and people don't know what they're doing once they take them. They don't know what impact they're having. Matthew goes on to talk about crystal meth and the impact that it can have on your mental state. Hallucinations are a common side effect of crystal meth, especially after you've been up for 3 days solid with no sleep. Once they start, they are likely to come back whenever you use. And he continues with a story from his friend Sean. My friend found himself running through the streets of Stockwell, screaming that the government was after him. We've all probably witnessed, especially in London, people who are behaving in this manner, and it's easy to write them off. But these people have lives, these people have families, they have friends that care about them. Someone I knew got addicted to crystal meth and begun hearing voices every time that he used. And then it began to progress beyond when he was using, and he would hear voices when he was sober. And what it progressed to was every time that he used, he thought that the neighbors were trying to get in through his roof window. And so he'd climb up there. Luckily, he got help, he sought help, and he's now long in recovery. But it's quite scary what situations you can put yourself into when you're inebriated like that. Then Matthew talks about chemsex. There is a popularity amongst gay men of using drugs during sex. And these parties, known as chill outs, are quite common. He refers to internalized homophobia and inner shame as the sources. He states it's all still there. Things like the shame, feeling physically inadequate, a core belief that sex is dirty, that it's a sin and is associated with disease. This internalized shame seems to keep coming back. There's so many beliefs that we are brought up to think that we internalize that ultimately impact our behavior around those things. So seeing sex as dirty, seeing sex as secret, as transactional even. I was in a situationship recently, and when I asked the guy how he was feeling, and he said that he didn't think that he would ever come out or ever tell anyone, and that was his burden to bear. And that's when I had to cut off the relationship of any kind, because he there was, to me, showing internalized homophobia. And I'm not going to be a dirty little secret. I'm not going to be this hidden shame. I'm not going to be that. That's just going to make me feel undervalued. Matthew does discuss each drug and the real effects that it's having. And if you haven't read the book, I would implore you to read the book, because this section is too intense and I don't feel comfortable picking out quotes. But essentially, he goes through each drug and lists the chemical impacts that it's having on your body. And it's shocking to me how little I knew about each one. He lingers on G, or GHB, because it connects to the previously mentioned chill outs, these parties. I think it seems to me that people aren't talking about this issue. It doesn't seem like anyone is talking about it. The mainstream obviously understands that drugs are a problem and an issue in society, but it doesn't really feel like the magnitude of the issue is comprehended. It can almost be guaranteed that at any given weekend, there are countless flats in London and probably in the major UK cities across the country, filled with gay men, potentially filled with all kinds of people, continuously partying from Friday night, Saturday night to Monday morning, every single week. It's not that they shouldn't be allowed to do that, but the accessibility to drugs and the things that can happen at these parties, it raises some eyebrows, at least for me. I know I've witnessed it, I've experienced it. It's a world that is just unregulated. He talks about G and states getting the dose and timing correct is crucial. If you overdose, you can go into a coma, commonly known as going under. Going under happens all the time. It is a normal occurrence when a group of people take G. David Stewart estimates that although 95% of people who go under wake up, 5% do not. That's quite a shocking statistic, really, because every single time you do this drug, you're taking a bet that you are going to be that 95% and not that 5%. G is so normalized in the gay community. It's so just outwardly discussed, regularly discussed, so accessible. And I mentioned that this section is quite intense. One bit that conveys that for me, talking about G, he states, once you are addicted, you are really addicted. If they don't get their G on time, their withdrawals are really dangerous, and people can die from that alone. The idea that withdrawals alone can kill you is something that I think people attribute to a drug like heroin, something that is very much off the curve. Someone who's a party goer probably would never touch heroin, but G is almost on that level of addictiveness, of danger, of risk. Chill outs and these sex parties connect to the historical locations of bathhouses, but now understood to be saunas. And these places are filled with drug use, and they are very unregulated and not checked on, and the people are not trained. He lists some stories from around the time that the book was written. In February 2012, a 41-year-old man died in the Pleasuredome sauna in Waterloo. 4 months later, another in the central London sauna Sweatbox. And a month after that, another in Chariot's sauna, Liverpool Street. All three died from cardiac arrest with GHB and methadone in their blood. And these saunas, Pleasuredome, Sweatbox, are still going. They're still open. And I know that there are commonly stories of people dying. It really gives the idea that these places aren't safe necessarily. You go in thinking they're safe because they're an establishment, they're an organization, but these people aren't trained. And I'm not saying that we should close them, not saying that they should be closed down, because there's history there, there's culture there. There's a reason that they exist. They were born out of necessity because gay men needed places to have sex and meet each other in private. And so I don't think that they should be removed because there is culture there. And I think it's important to keep that culture alive, but there's got to be a solution. Matthew quotes from a friend of his who works at Dean Street. Did he think the situation was getting worse? Oh my God, yes. In the last 3 or 4 years, it's gone bananas. The amount of trauma in clubs is not just 10% up. We're talking quadrupling from 2009, 2010. Maybe 10 times up. It's a steep graph. And this is 10 years ago now. And if you think that the accessibility to drugs has only gotten more accessible, this means that the stats quadrupling back then is likely gone off the rails now. The cultural context of today is also not in this book, obviously, but lockdown would have progressed all this stuff. I know it did for me. That's where things really began to be an issue. Is lockdown. And it is a difficult topic to talk about. There's so much intense stuff in this section, but the main point is that I know it to be true. I've seen it and it still feels like an unaddressed issue. Even when people talk about drugs in the mainstream, it's not referring to this side of it. Ultimately, it's underpinned by what Matthew states. The sex on drugs scene appeals to so many gay men because of the issues we have. It's underpinned by this inner shame. It's underpinned by this trauma that we all share because of growing up in a society that told us we were wrong. And we have to address that to be able to address this. And it doesn't seem like we're ready to address the inner shame, but I feel like you're never going to be ready. Just leading up to closing off this section, I want to quote some statistics from a Dean Street study that Matthew uses, and then end with a key quote from this section. This is from a Dean Street study in January 2014. In the first 3 months, 300 men who said they used drugs were questioned, resulting in the following statistics. 65% reported 4 or more partners per bender. 70% could not remember the last time they had sex sober from drugs or alcohol. 46% were HIV positive. 34% of those on HIV medications said they'd missed doses when high, typically every weekend. 10% were currently on hepatitis C treatment. Another 15% had had hepatitis C in the past. 45% of these 300 men had injected drugs in the last 3 months. 54% of these had only ever been injected by other people. 45% reported sharing needles. Those are obviously quite shocking statistics that I think paint the picture. This is a real issue with quite heavy consequences, and often it's met with this retort that it's being sensationalized. And I guess these statistics can show it's not being sensationalized. This isn't just about people who have some mental health issues that are using drugs to cope. This is about a deep-rooted societal issue that we're not shifting the dial on fast enough, in my opinion. We haven't seen the impact of the change in social opinion yet, and maybe it will be a lot better. But the discourse that's currently happening on trans issues and trans rights and trans lives is going to have increasingly detrimental impacts on those kids' adulthoods. And it's scary to see people talk so flippantly about other people and not consider that in the future, this is going to have detrimental impact on their quality of life. Matthew ends this section with a comment that starts to give the idea that it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We're our own worst enemy because as a community, it's hard to escape this drug-fueled, alcohol-fueled world because it's all-encompassing. He ends the section with a quote from someone he's interviewed stating, "It's not a community anymore. We've turned into a community of individuals." Moving on to the next section, which is called Looking for Warmth in Cold Places, the sex issue. Matthew continues the intensity. He starts with Grindr, and he pinpoints something that I've definitely done in the past, which is keeping Grindr downloaded just in case you find a boyfriend. And that connects to this dark, depressing, doom and gloom mindset about finding love and finding connection. And Matthew speaks to a friend of his and he states, "My desire to be desired had been compulsive." The idea of sex addiction is then raised in this section. And sex addiction is one of those topics where, because sex isn't a substance, people will push back on this idea of sex addiction. And Matthew later gets onto the sex positivity movement dismissing some of these issues because it's seen as slut shaming. But Matthew states, "Loneliness is another of those key controversial words that is problematic for the guardians of modern gay culture, and I understand why. It's been used as a weapon against us, the phrase a sad and lonely lifestyle." This theme of historical stigmas and historical negative imagery of gay men coming back to haunt us is important. Our resistance to admitting the problem is because by admitting the problem, we feel like we're maybe giving truth to those homophobic representations of gay men. If we admit them we're sad and lonely, then the homophobes were right, but it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Later on in the section, Matthew speaks to a friend of his that says something quite poignant, which is, "What would feel like a crushing rejection in person has absolutely zero impact to me on Grindr." And what's crazy about that is I hadn't really ever thought of it, but rejection avoidance is something that Alan Downs in The Velvet Rage brings up as a symptom of the problem. We avoid feeling rejection, we avoid feeling shame so much so that when we do feel it, it's 10 times as worse. It seems what is being said here is that Grindr is just one of those tools that we use to stay away from rejection, stay away from shame. And I had never thought of it as a tool for me to avoid real life rejection. And as somebody who has ADHD, one of the symptoms of that is rejection sensitivity disorder, which is a increased reaction to rejection or perceived rejections. But to put it plainly, someone that Matthew speaks to on page 199 states, "It's easier to drop your pants than to emotionally connect with someone." And sex addiction as a whole is born out of loneliness. Matthew speaks to a professional and he says that these chill outs are almost like community centers, which is an interesting image to present, that these chill outs are like the places that we go to meet each other, because historically there were saunas, there were bathhouses, there were cruising spots. It seems like chill outs are just another one of these places that we go to meet each other. Matthew states it's logical that we might be suspicious that the concept of sex addiction is another part of the homophobic arsenal. But he also states the brain on cocaine and the brain when sexually aroused are virtually indistinguishable. And I relate to that resistancy to accept that things are the way they are, especially in response to feelings of injustice. You know, feeling that society is homophobic and that's the issue and not me and my problems, it's homophobia. It's a difficult admission to accept that it actually is you and it is the problem. It's also important to remember that it's kind of both, because you are the way that you are, you have these problems because of homophobia, because of oppression and marginalization, and all of these experiences growing up that led you to have such trauma responses. And that leads on to what Matthew states, that our first sexual experiences, especially as gay men, are usually enmeshed in shame. He states, disgust and rejection became tied up with excitement, and sexual shame became painful and addictively thrilling. That's a really interesting point, that disgust and rejection almost became exciting. It became part of the ritual of meeting up with people. I know that when I turned 18, I instantly downloaded Grindr, and I felt that to be a gay man, I needed to lose my virginity as soon as possible. And I knew university was right around the corner, and I felt like I had to be ready. And so I engaged in this kind of behavior. And of course it was enmeshed in shame, because I was lying to my family, I was lying to my friends, I was going off in secret. It was all this huge, dirty little secret. And like I said, it's all built off of homophobia. I mentioned earlier in the episode, there's no guide to being gay. There's no one teaching you how to be safe on the internet in regards to sex. There's no guide to Grindr. There's no one telling you this is how it works. It's all built off of homophobia, like these subtle biases and these judgments that are imbued upon us by other people or by our parents, such as asking if someone's got a girlfriend or assuming that your child will marry a wife, like being at the barber's and you're sat down and they try to strike up a conversation with you. Have you got a girlfriend? It's things like that that subtly give you the idea that what you are isn't right, that you wanting to be with a man is abnormal and not natural. Matthew quotes something from Catherine Bewley, a sexual abuse care worker at Gallup, the UK's leading anti-LGBT hate crimes charity, which articulates what I am saying in a much better way. She states, if you're a young gay person, you might be lucky in a fantastic school with fantastic friends, but you might not. Where is the safe space? If school isn't really safe and home is not safe, where do you go? You go online or onto apps. I think young people of all sexualities are pushed in this way currently, but it's particularly true for LGBT young people. If you go online, it is highly sexualized. It's about what you look like physically, what you do, what you're prepared to do. One click and you're going to get barebacking, drugs. If you're 14, how do you assess what is normal? As a young person, naturally, you want to explore sex. You want to explore all of this. There's a certain attractiveness to this, being underground, clandestine. That's my world. That's quite exciting, until it does your head in or something bad happens and there's no protection. And that's really what I'm getting at. I came to accepting myself as gay around the age of 16, 17. And I use YouTube and videos of YouTubers coming out and them talking about the gay world as my learning space. But I definitely internalized a lot of negative lessons and probably watched a lot of videos on guides on stuff that I wasn't ready to learn about. For me, it was definitely all underpinned by this feeling that I needed to learn how to be a gay man. I needed to learn how to be what these people I was seeing on YouTube were. Later in the section, Matthew talks about a 40-year-old gay man, and he's speaking to a person that works within the sexual health space. He says he remembers a patient with HIV who was newly single, who said, I've got to learn what it's like to be a gay man at 40. This person rightly questions back, what does that mean? You have to learn to be a gay man at 40. Why can't you be yourself? That last question is really important. And I think it's something that even to this day, I'm struggling to learn, but trying to apply. Why can't you just be yourself? It's hard to know how to be yourself when for so long you've been somebody else, because how do you start being someone that's not written down and not on YouTube. There's no guide to being gay, but there's definitely no guide to being yourself. With the enmeshed in shame sex experiences, Matthew talks about getting jaded, and he talks to Jason, who has a lot of negative sex experiences. And really what it shows is that terrifying things can happen when you don't know what's right and wrong, and when you're not taught things correctly, when there's no one to tell you what's right and wrong, when there's no protection. And reading Jason's stories really awoke a pure, deep-rooted panic-like fear in me, because what he was talking about and these scary things that he was talking about were relatable, but also they connected to something that I've needed to be scared of. I've learned to be scared of. He speaks about how he's gotten jaded from these things. And broadly, this is rationalization. And I've talked about how I rationalized a lot of things growing up, such as suicidal ideation, depression, negative thoughts. I rationalized all these things. I felt like it was normal, and I told myself it was normal. And so it didn't seem as scary. Matthew refers to this as minimization, which they're seemingly one and the same. I just use a different word, but he states minimization happens because to connect with the reality of what really happened, what you really felt, is too painful. He even talks about intellectualizing. And I still do both of these things, and I try not to. Even by having this podcast and talking about my behavior, I intellectualize it. And it's difficult to get out of that. Minimization is difficult because you only realize that you've done it when all the bad stuff comes up again and you have to go back and process all of that. It's definitely something that's coming up for me a lot recently. But back to Grindr, where I've gotten to it is deleting it completely, and I've deleted it for good, and I won't be re-downloading it, which Matthew discusses is quite common. But he also states, if overcoming low self-esteem is about finding a safe space with people who respect and value you, then seeing hot guys listing off the reasons why you're not good enough for them before you've even spoken to them is the last possible thing any of us needs. And that ultimately is why I've gone away from it, and I don't see myself going back. And in this section, one of the people he speaks to describes it as like a drug itself. Another big reason that I want to stay away from Grindr is the danger of it. Matthew talks about Cucumber, which is a TV show written by Russell T Davies, and he quotes a character that states, "Sometimes it's just better to go home." He continues, "We know that is a painful truth. We are all worth far more than a risky shag." And I cannot express how much I related to this idea. And I would even take that idea one step further and say that it's always better to just go home. Whenever your mind raises the question of going home, that's the alarm bell that's telling you to just go home. With the topic of this section being sex, Matthew obviously can't not talk about HIV. There's a really sad quote in this section, which is, "Without a shadow of a doubt, there has been a huge increase in people coming in with sexualized drug problems." He talks of people who lived through the AIDS epidemic now being brought down by drugs. That idea that they survived something so tragic to then be brought down by drugs, which people aren't talking about. Matthew does seemingly use AIDS and HIV as a marker of the drug problem on pages 212 to 213. And I don't like the way that he connects it intrinsically, because though they do tend to come hand in hand, that's not the full picture of HIV transmissions. And it's portraying HIV as something that, to me, perpetuates that stigma that's around it. We can understand that drugs are a problem in and of themselves without using HIV in this way. We can also then comment on the connection between the two separately. Contextually, this was written before wide PrEP access, so I understand that there is a certain difference between my perception and likely the perception of the time at which this was written. Matthew also gives some HIV statistics, but I don't want to quote those. Instead, I'm going to quote from gov.uk the 2023 HIV transmission report. And it states the number of HIV diagnoses first made in England rose by 6% from 2,313 in 2021 to 2,444 in 2022. But variation between population groups remains. First diagnoses made in England among gay, bisexual men and men who have sex with men fell by 8% from 784 in 2021 to 724 in 2022. A 3% drop was observed living in London, with a 10% decline amongst those outside of London. Among heterosexual men and women living in London, diagnoses rose by 14%, from 284 in 2021 to 325 in 2022. Outside London, there was an 11% rise. The rise was particularly steep in women living outside London who were exposed through sex with men. I think the important call out there is that these diagnoses are decreasing amongst gay and bisexual men, but increasing amongst straight people. And that's likely due to the gay community's access to PrEP and knowledge of its existence. But it's definitely a flag to raise that heterosexual people are unknowing and uneducated about the protection that they could have. Lastly, on this section, Matthew discusses how the sex positivity movement and this idea of slut shaming has come to dismiss the issue of sex addiction, because this movement of sex positivity does believe that multiple partners and kinks and fetishes are okay, which I agree with. But, and Matthew puts it better, he states, to say we need to take more care of ourselves and each other is sometimes considered to be slut-shaming. And that's the key point, that we need to be taking care of ourselves and each other. To end the section, Matthew uses a quote from someone that he interviews. And he states, having it on tap so readily available changes your relationship to sex. That's the thing with Grindr and with sex addiction. Having it so readily available is fundamentally changing our relationship to it. The last section is called Out of Control and Without Care, Rock Bottoms. And obviously, as the name gives away, it is about rock bottoms, the turning point in which you admit that there's a problem. And the name Out of Control and Without Care is very much how it feels. I've had my fair share of rock bottoms, two of which are notable. It does feel like you've caught yourself out of control. He states in this section, the great thing about rock bottoms is that the only way is up. And that is something that I said in a previous episode about how I felt in regards to some realizations I'd had about myself lately. Yes, it's difficult to process those emotions, and yes, it's difficult to come to those realizations, but there's almost an optimistic twist. You know that this is step one, this is the beginning, and not the end. Broadly, this section functions as a summary. He states, people carry that weight all through their lives. Everyone thinks it's easy to be gay now. It's not. There's still lots of problems. You have people that are carrying baggage from 30 or 40 years ago when they have been spat at or punched on the street. This is ultimately the root source of everything that he talks about. And he continues this by stating, the public health epidemic isn't solely HIV anymore, and it probably never was. It is drink, drugs, substance misuse, suicide ideation. It is mental health. Since this book has been written, I think there's been a lot more consideration about mental health and mental wellness and setting your mind right and processing things. But I think the gay community particularly is still seeing a resistancy to taking that advice. He summarizes the things that he touches upon, listing chronic oversensitivity, a codependent need to overdramatize, an inability to maintain boundaries or moderation, addictive tendencies, and an experience of severe homophobia. What I like about this chapter more than the rest is that it has a very optimistic but empathetic and emotional tone. He states, in regards to everything that he just listed and all of these things that he touches upon in the book, it's easy to throw up your arms in disgust at some of the behaviour I have described. But all I know for sure is that the men I have written about have one thing in common. They all grew up in fear, without adequate help, all dealing with a big, unacceptable secret on their own, with zero support. This is our story. And I think it's really powerful what he's trying to convey, which is this isn't about a group of people who happen to have the same experience. This is about a system that failed us. This is about the repercussions of societal issues. And we're seeing this now because of what happened in the 80s and the 90s. But what are we going to see in 20 years from now with the kids of today, with the trans kids of today? He flips that famous Margaret Thatcher quote on its head and states, "Society failed to teach them that they did, in fact, have an inalienable right to be gay." And I really like flipping that quote on its head, partially because it's Margaret Thatcher. He also quotes Ford Hickson, and Ford Hickson raises something interesting. He states, "I think it might be harder now. You're so much more visible. You're under more scrutiny. People talk about it, demand things of it. I don't think it's any easier to be a gay teenager. It's a fucking chaotic time." I don't know necessarily how I feel about that, whether I disagree or agree, but I think what he's pinpointing, that it's not easier to be gay, that it's different, and that because of the visibility and because of the outness, there is more scrutiny, there is more challenge. There's constant debates about rights and constant debates about what should be acceptable and what shouldn't. And that's not easy to deal with. I don't know if I agree that it's harder than how it was, but I think the point that being visible has led to a different set of challenges, I do think that that holds some weight. Matthew goes on to list some rock bottom stories, and he even shares his own. And there's a few key points that I wanted to pull out from them. I won't read the stories. I would recommend that you read the book because they're quite poignant and quite powerful. But in one of them, they state, "He could see he was stuck. I became aware of the continual cycles." In another one of the stories, he states, "I realised I was so far removed from the man I thought I was going to become when I first moved to London, and had all these hopes and dreams. It felt like I had already died. I think I did die, emotionally." And another one states, "There was no way of thinking myself out of this. I had no spirit." I think those three quotes touch upon some key characteristics of what it feels like to be in a rock bottom. This feeling of being stuck, this feeling of being in a continuous cycle and only just realizing that you were, and being frustrated that you didn't realize it sooner, but also being disappointed and ashamed that you're not who you thought you would be. But even more than that, being stuck in your usual ability to think your way out of things, being stuck and being unable to do that because this isn't something you can think your way out of. This is emotional. This is deep rooted stuff. For me, my rock bottom found me standing alone on a tube platform, just crying my eyes out, having to sheepishly head home. And it was that come to moment of, I just can't do this anymore. I don't enjoy it and I'm doing it for the wrong reasons. I can't do this anymore. I can't put myself in these situations where I'm continuously making myself feel awful. Just before I close off the episode, the next section, which will be the next episode, starts off by using an extract from a song by Elton John. And it states, "I could have sworn we were all locked in. Ain't that what you said? I never knew it could hurt so bad when the power of love is dead. But giving in to the night time ain't no cure for the pain. You gotta wade into the water. You gotta learn to live again." This has been Saying Something Sober, keeping me sober 292 days as of recording episode 7B.